7.1 million people in Britain are on an NHS waiting list right now. Not for a checkup. Not for a flu jab. For surgeries. For scans. For treatments that, if delayed long enough, stop being treatable at all. And the part nobody is saying out loud, last year, almost 29,000 of them died before they were ever seen. Not after treatment went wrong. Before it even started. This isn't a "the NHS is busy" story. This isn't a funding headline you scroll past. This is what happens when a system built to save you quietly becomes the thing standing between you and getting better. And once you understand how it actually works, you will never look at a GP referral letter the same way again. You've felt this, even if you've never been on a waiting list yourself. That moment when someone tells you, "I'm waiting for my hip operation," and you don't even ask when. Because you already know the answer is going to be a year. Maybe 2. You just nod. Because in Britain, that's normal now. The NHS Constitution says 92% of patients should start treatment within 18 weeks of referral. That's not an aspiration. It's a legal standard. That standard has not been met since 2015. 11 years. Not one of them on target. So when people say, the waiting list is bad, what they actually mean is, there is no list anymore in the way you picture it. There's a queue with no guaranteed end, and the people in it have simply learned to stop expecting one. Here's what almost nobody explains properly. A waiting list this size doesn't fail in one big collapse. It fails in 3 quiet ways, stacked on top of each other, each one making the next one worse. First, the math's never balanced. Before COVID, the list stood at 4.4 million. Today it's 7.1 million. Staff numbers did grow. Doctor numbers are up 24% and nurse numbers up 22% over the last 5 years. Funding grew too. But demand grew faster than both of those, every single year, and nobody closed that gap. They just let it compound, year after year, until temporary backlog became the permanent shape of British healthcare. Second, the list quietly empties itself the wrong way. In January 2026 alone, 268,283 people came off the NHS waiting list. On paper, that's progress. Officials called it progress. The headlines said the backlog was shrinking. But look closer at how those people actually left the list. Some got treated, yes, plenty did. But the list also clears when someone goes private instead. It clears when someone dies while still waiting. And it clears, almost unbelievably, when someone fails to respond to a text message asking if they still need their appointment. Hospitals are paid £33 for every name they remove from the list. Not £33 for treating someone. £33 for taking a name off a spreadsheet. So a waiting list can shrink without a single extra patient being treated. It just needs fewer people left on it to count. And there are several quiet ways to make that happen that have nothing to do with anyone getting better. Third, the people with money simply leave. 16% of Britons paid for private treatment in the past year. That's up from 9% just 3 years ago, almost double. Of the people who went private, nearly 4 in 10 said the reason was simple: they could not wait any longer. That's not the NHS getting more efficient. That's the NHS quietly splitting into 2 systems wearing one name, a free one that takes years, and a paid one that takes weeks, for anyone who can afford the second option. The averages hide something important. Not every wait is equal, and some specialties are in far worse shape than the headline number suggests. Ear, nose, and throat treatment, something as routine as a hearing problem, a chronic sinus issue, a referral for a child who can't hear properly in class, has nearly 600,000 people waiting. Only just over half of them are seen within the 18-week target. The other half are simply absorbed into the system's silence, waiting for a slot that may or may not come this year. Trauma and orthopedics, hip replacements, knee replacements, the operations that let older people walk without pain, have some of the longest queues in the entire NHS. Eye treatment isn't far behind. Heart conditions, gynecology, urology, all sitting in the same backlog, all measured in months that quietly turn into years. And these aren't abstract specialties. They're the ones that decide whether someone's parent can still climb stairs, whether someone's child can hear a teacher, whether someone's pain becomes manageable or becomes the new normal they're told to live with, because there's no slot available. Now picture the version of this that never makes it into a government press release. A woman in her late 20s starts getting pain her GP can't fully explain. She's referred for further investigation. The appointment gets booked. Then it gets pushed back. Then pushed back again, because the clinic is overbooked and someone has decided her case isn't urgent enough to jump the queue. 18 months pass. She's still working through all of it, because she has bills like everyone else, and the NHS doesn't pause your rent while you wait for your name to come up. She's just working through pain that, 2 years earlier, would have stopped her from getting out of bed in the first place. Now it's just background noise she's learned to function around. By the time she's finally seen, what would have been a relatively straightforward procedure has become something bigger. A longer operation. A longer recovery. Higher risk, because the condition had time to progress while she waited. And somewhere in those 18 months, she seriously considered paying for it privately, borrowing the money, taking out a loan, anything to stop the waiting, because at some point, waiting stops feeling like patience and starts feeling like punishment for not having enough money to skip the line. This is the part the statistics can describe but never quite capture. A delay doesn't just mean later. For a huge number of conditions, later means worse. A torn meniscus that needed a small, simple procedure becomes osteoarthritis that needs a full knee replacement years sooner than it should have. A small, manageable hernia becomes a strangulated one, a medical emergency instead of a scheduled, low-risk fix. A tumor caught early, treatable and survivable, becomes a tumor caught late, when the options have narrowed down to something much harder. The waiting list isn't only a queue for treatment anymore. For thousands of people, it is actively deciding how sick they will be by the time they are finally treated, turning curable problems into chronic ones, and chronic ones into emergencies. And for some of them, the 28,908 who died after waiting longer than 18 weeks last year, 7,737 of whom had been waiting more than a full year, it decides they never get treated at all. So who's actually responsible for this? It's tempting to point at doctors. It's tempting to point at nurses, at receptionists, at the person who didn't pick up the phone fast enough. But ask anyone working inside the NHS and they'll tell you the same thing, almost word for word: there simply aren't enough of them to go around. There are still more than 125,000 vacancies across the NHS in England, wards running short-staffed on a normal Tuesday, let alone during a bad winter. Clinics overbooked by design, because there's no slack left in the system to absorb anything going wrong. One member of staff calling in sick can mean an entire afternoon of appointments quietly disappearing into next month. Meanwhile, private hospital groups are stepping into the exact gap the NHS can't fill, and the NHS is paying them to do it. Hundreds of millions of pounds in public money flowing into private providers every year to deliver the elective care the public system can't keep up with on its own. So the same system that can't give you your operation on time will happily fund someone else to do it faster, if the paperwork and the contract line up, even while individual patients are still told there's nothing available for months. The government has set its own target: 65% of patients treated within 18 weeks by March 2026. The most recent figures sit somewhere around 61 to 65%, depending on the month you look at. That is, technically, progress. The waiting list has fallen from its 2023 peak. Ministers have pointed to it as proof the plan is working. But progress toward a target that used to be 92%, missed for 11 consecutive years, isn't recovery. It's renegotiating failure downward and calling the smaller failure a win. Nobody is lying about the numbers. They're just choosing very carefully which numbers to put in the headline, and which ones, like 28,908, stay buried 3 pages into a report nobody outside Parliament reads. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. The NHS was built on one promise: that getting sick in Britain would never depend on what's sitting in your bank account. Right now, for millions of people, that promise survives on paper. In practice, what's in your bank account quietly decides whether you wait 2 years or 2 weeks, whether your condition stays treatable or turns into something worse while you wait your turn, whether your name gets removed from a list because you finally got treated, or because you didn't reply to a text message, or because you're no longer alive to. The question isn't whether the NHS is under pressure. Everyone already knows that. You don't need a statistic to tell you something you already feel every time you hear someone say, "I'm still waiting." The real question is whether this country still believes healthcare should be free at the point of need for everyone, or whether it has already quietly accepted that speed now has a price tag, and only some people can afford to pay it. What do you think actually needs to change first to fix this? Tell me below. I read every comment.